I remember the way the room smelled that day, like polished oak, old leather, and the faint trace of Eleanor's rose perfume, the one she wore only for moments she deemed significant. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in thin beams of winter light that sliced across the table, catching the dust in the air like tiny flecks of gold. I sat at the far end, my hands resting on my knees, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite name. And then, without any ceremony, without even a flicker of hesitation, my grandmother looked me directly in the eye and said, "You're not getting a penny from me." Her voice was calm, almost bored, as if she were commenting on the weather. Then she closed the folder in front of her with a quiet thud that echoed in the stillness. For a heartbeat, I forgot to breathe. The others reacted before I did. Amelia's lips curved into that slow, practiced smirk she had worn since we were children, the kind that always said, "I win." My father shifted uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't speak. He rarely spoke in Eleanor's presence. Richard Lawson, the family lawyer, cleared his throat softly, glancing between us as if trying to decide whether to proceed or to get out while he still could. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it gave no warmth. The chill in the room came from Eleanor herself. She was sitting tall in her high-backed chair, her silver hair pinned perfectly, her pearl necklace gleaming like a quiet weapon. My pulse roared in my ears. I wanted to ask her why, but the words stuck in my throat, trapped by decades of unspoken rules. I had prepared myself for many things that morning. Awkward silences, veiled insults, maybe even a few passive-aggressive remarks about my career choices, but not for this. Not for the blunt, surgical precision of those 9 words. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, my cheeks flushing, and a bitter taste rising in my mouth. 100 memories flashed through my mind. Her hand on my shoulder when I was 10, telling me to stand tall. The way she'd once slipped a bracelet into my palm on my 16th birthday. The Christmas morning she'd kissed my cheek before handing me carefully wrapped books she'd chosen herself. All of it seemed to dissolve now, crumbling under the weight of her cold dismissal. It felt like I was losing her twice, once as a grandmother, and now as someone who had believed in me. "Shall I continue?" Richard asked, his voice low, almost apologetic. Eleanor didn't even look at him. "No," she replied, her tone as sharp as the cut-glass decanter on the sideboard. "That will be all for today." She rose from her chair with surprising swiftness for someone her age, gathering the will folder and tucking it neatly under her arm. The pearls at her neck caught the light again, throwing a pale shimmer across the table. Without another glance in my direction, she swept out of the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, in steady, deliberate beats, like the ticking of a clock that had just run out of time for me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amelia broke it first, leaning back in her chair with a sigh so exaggerated it felt rehearsed. "Well," she said, "I suppose some of us have to accept reality sooner than others." I didn't even look at her. My father shifted again, as though debating whether to speak, but his jaw tightened and he stayed quiet. Richard began shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact with me, his hands betraying a nervous energy. I realized then that this wasn't just about money. Eleanor's words had landed like a verdict on my very place in this family, a statement that went beyond the legal and into something far more personal. She hadn't just cut me out of the will, she had cut me out of her legacy. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as though the ground itself had shifted. The air in the room was heavy, pressing against my chest. I could feel Amelia's eyes following me, feeding off my discomfort, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. My father rose too, his hand brushing my arm in a brief, almost hesitant gesture of support. We walked out together, but his silence was deafening. I wanted him to tell me this was all some misunderstanding, that Eleanor had her reasons and they would make sense in time, but he didn't. And deep down, I think I knew. This was exactly the kind of moment my grandmother had been preparing for all my life. Outside, the winter air hit my face like a slap, crisp and cutting. I stood there for a moment, staring at the grand facade of Eleanor's estate, its tall windows reflecting the pale afternoon light. I had grown up visiting this house, playing hide-and-seek in its labyrinth of rooms, imagining myself one day belonging to its quiet grandeur. But now, the walls seemed to reject me, the stone itself holding my grandmother's words like a curse. As I climbed into my car, I realized I didn't just want to leave. I wanted to understand. And that was the first moment I decided that whatever Eleanor was hiding, whatever had made her shut me out so completely, I would find it, even if it broke me. 2 nights later, I found myself pacing my apartment like a caged animal. The silence was unbearable, filled with the echo of Eleanor's words replaying over and over in my mind until they felt etched into my bones. I'd tried to bury myself in work, to drown the day in coffee and deadlines, but every idle moment brought her face back into focus, calm, composed, merciless. My phone buzzed with messages from Amelia, thinly veiled barbs disguised as just checking in. I deleted them without opening. What gnawed at me wasn't just the insult, it was the void it left behind. Why? What had I done to be so thoroughly erased? And more disturbingly, why did it feel like she'd been planning it for years? I didn't go looking for the letter. Not exactly. I went looking for closure, or at least something to anchor my spinning thoughts. My father had given me an old cedar box years ago, claiming it held memories worth keeping. I had shoved it to the back of my closet and forgotten about it until that night. As I dragged it out, dust motes swirled in the air like tiny ghosts. Inside were faded photographs, ticket stubs from long-forgotten plays, and brittle newspaper clippings yellowed with age. And then, at the very bottom, wedged between the pages of a leather-bound journal, was an envelope with my name written in Eleanor's unmistakable hand. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as though it had been handled many times before being hidden away. My hands trembled as I slid a finger under the flap, half expecting the paper to disintegrate at my touch. The letter inside was short, barely half a page, but it stole the air from my lungs. "You will not understand this now," it began, "but one day you will. There are truths that must be protected, no matter the cost. Forgive me for the role I must play in keeping them." There was no date, no signature beyond the familiar looping E, and yet it felt like a knife slipping between my ribs. I read it 3 times before setting it down, each word pressing heavier than the last. She wasn't just cutting me out. She was hiding something big enough to justify betraying her own blood. I thought of calling my father, demanding answers, but the idea fizzled before I even reached for the phone. He would either deflect or retreat into silence, just as he always did when the subject turned to Eleanor. My father had been her dutiful son all his life, and that loyalty had cost him more than he'd ever admit. Asking him to betray her now would be like asking him to sever a limb. So instead, I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into clarity. But the more I stared, the more I felt it wasn't just a note. It was a challenge, an invitation to dig where I wasn't supposed to. The next morning, I drove past Eleanor's estate, telling myself it was just to clear my head, though I knew better. The wrought iron gates were closed, as always, their black bars cold and unyielding. Through them, I could see the faint outline of her in the upstairs window, a silhouette framed in pale light. She was holding something. Papers, maybe. Her posture stiff, as though she were expecting an intruder. The sight chilled me. For the first time in my life, I realized I was no longer welcome there, not even as a visitor. And yet, the idea of staying away felt impossible. Every stone of that house seemed to be whispering my name, daring me to come closer. That evening, unable to shake the pull, I called Richard Lawson. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. "You're not supposed to be calling me about this," he said immediately, as though he'd been rehearsing the warning. "I just want to understand," I replied. "I deserve to understand." There was a long pause on the line, the kind that feels heavy with unsaid things. Finally, he sighed. "Come by tomorrow," he said, lowering his voice. "I'll tell you what I can, but not over the phone." Before I could thank him, he hung up. I sat there in the dark, my glass untouched, the letter still lying on the table like an open wound. I didn't know it then, but that conversation would be the first crack in a wall Eleanor had spent decades building. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of my apartment felt amplified, every shadow stretched too long. I dreamed of Eleanor's face, but not as it had been at the will reading. This time she was younger, her hair loose, her eyes softer. She was holding my hand, guiding me down a long hallway lined with closed doors. One by one she opened them, revealing rooms filled with things I couldn't quite see, their details blurring as I tried to focus. When she reached the last door, she turned to me and whispered, "This is the one you must never open." And then she disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. I woke up with my heart pounding, the letter still in my mind like a key I didn't yet know how to use. The next morning, I arrived at Richard Lawson's office half an hour early, my nerves a tight knot in my stomach. His building was an unassuming brick structure tucked between a bakery and a hardware store, a place you could pass 100 times without noticing. The glass door was still locked, so I waited in my car, drumming my fingers against the steering wheel. Every minute felt heavier than the last, the weight of Eleanor's letter sitting in my bag like contraband. When he finally arrived, he glanced around before unlocking the door, as if he were making sure no one had followed him. His eyes met mine for only a moment before he muttered, "Come in, quickly." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of paper and coffee, the blinds drawn just enough to keep the sunlight from fully spilling in. Richard didn't sit at his desk. Instead, he stood by the window, his hands buried in his pockets. "I shouldn't even be meeting with you," he began, his voice low. "Your grandmother is careful, very careful. She doesn't make mistakes. If she's done something, it's because she planned it that way. Months, sometimes years, in advance." He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. What happened at the will reading wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, and it wasn't just about money. I told him about the letter, watching his face closely for any flicker of recognition. For a moment, something passed over his features, a flash of unease, but it was gone before I could pin it down. "That letter," he said slowly, "wasn't meant for you to find. And if you did, it means she's either slipping or she wanted you to start digging." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. "Why would she want that?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because she's testing you. She wants to see how far you'll go before you either walk away or uncover something she's spent her whole life protecting." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "What is she protecting?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard glanced toward the closed office door before lowering his voice even more. "There's a part of your family's history you've never been told. And Eleanor, she's the gatekeeper. But I can't just hand it to you. If I did, and she found out, it would cost me everything." His words frustrated me, but they also ignited something. Curiosity, yes, but also defiance. For the first time, I wasn't content to just accept the version of my family I'd been handed. I wanted the truth, even if it cut me open. Before I left, Richard slid a small, folded piece of paper across the desk. "This isn't much," he said, "but it's where you should start." The address scrawled inside wasn't familiar. Some street in a part of town I rarely visited. "What's there?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not what, who, and don't tell anyone I gave it to you." As I walked out, the paper burned in my pocket, heavier than it should have been. Outside, the morning felt sharper, the air carrying a faint bite that hadn't been there when I arrived. I drove straight to the address, my curiosity too strong to delay. The building was a narrow, weathered house with peeling paint and curtains drawn tight. For a long moment, I sat in the car, staring at the door, wondering if this was a mistake. Then it opened. A woman stepped out, tall, silver-haired, her eyes startlingly familiar in a way that made my breath catch. She looked directly at me, as though she had been expecting me all along. Without a word, she gestured for me to come inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, a strange heaviness settled over me. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and the walls were lined with photographs, none of which I recognized. The woman didn't offer her name, and I didn't ask. It felt as though speaking would shatter something fragile in the air. Instead, she handed me a small wooden box, her hands steady, but her gaze weighted with meaning. "Your grandmother would never forgive me for this," she said, her voice low, "but you deserve to know." I opened the box and froze. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a photograph. Eleanor, decades younger, holding a newborn, and she wasn't alone. The man beside her wasn't my grandfather. For a few long seconds, I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the photograph, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Eleanor's younger face stared back at me, radiant and unguarded in a way I had never witnessed in real life. Her arm cradled the baby protectively, but her other hand was resting on the shoulder of a man I had never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, serious eyes that seemed to pierce right through the camera. There was no trace of my grandfather's familiar features. My pulse began to hammer in my ears. "Who is he?" I whispered. The woman across from me studied my reaction before answering, her voice carrying a weight I couldn't yet name. His name was Daniel Mercer. The name felt alien on my tongue, but the way she said it made it sound like it should mean something to me. He was... She paused, searching for the right word. "He was the love of your grandmother's life." My breath caught. My grandmother, cold, controlled, and calculating Eleanor, had once been capable of that kind of passion? It didn't fit the woman I knew, the one who had just days ago looked me in the eye and told me I would never see a penny of her estate. I turned the photo over, half expecting some inscription, and there it was, 2 lines in faded ink, Daniel and Ellie, 1967, and below that, for our daughter someday. My stomach dropped. Daughter? I looked at the silver-haired woman, my voice trembling. You're telling me that baby isn't my mother? Then who? She cut me off with a slow shake of her head. That baby is your mother, but the man holding her was not her husband when you were born's father. And Eleanor has spent her whole life making sure no one ever connected those dots. My mind spun. If this was true, then my family history was built on a lie. My mother, my entire bloodline. It was tangled in something Eleanor had fought to bury for decades. Why are you telling me this? I demanded. The woman's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. Because the will wasn't about money. It was about control. Eleanor cut you out not because she didn't love you, but because she's afraid of you finding out what she's done. She thinks keeping you on the outside will keep you from pulling on the wrong thread. The walls felt as if they were closing in. I glanced around the small living room again, my eyes catching on a dusty shelf in the corner. A wooden frame stood there, holding another photograph. This one showed Daniel holding hands with the silver-haired woman, both younger then, standing in front of a car. And there, in the corner of the photo, Eleanor was visible again, her face half turned toward them, smiling. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only a strange kind of acceptance. You knew her, I said slowly. Not just as an acquaintance. You were part of her life, the woman nodded. And for a time, I was part of her family, until she decided I wasn't. Her words landed with a thud in my chest. This wasn't just about a secret affair. It was about something much more deliberate. There's something else you need to see, she said, disappearing into another room. She returned with a thin, yellowing envelope. The seal was unbroken, but my name was written across it in Eleanor's familiar, sharp handwriting. My throat tightened as I reached for it. I don't understand, I murmured. She gave this to you? The woman shook her head. No. She gave it to Daniel decades ago. He never opened it, and after he passed, it ended up with me. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, as though it carried more than just paper. My instincts screamed that whatever was inside would change everything. Still, I couldn't bring myself to tear it open. Not yet. Why now? I asked her. Why give it to me today? She gave me a sad smile. Because Eleanor is getting older, and the truth has a way of finding its own timing. If you don't face it now, it will come for you when you're not ready. I slipped the envelope into my bag, feeling its presence like a heartbeat. The woman walked me to the door, but just before I stepped outside, she said one last thing. If you want the whole truth, you'll have to go where Eleanor swore she'd never set foot again. She handed me a slip of paper with a single word written on it. Ravenwood. The name alone sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I had no idea why, but I knew that was where the answers lived. The drive to Ravenwood felt like crossing into another world. I left the familiar streets of the city behind, watching them dissolve into long stretches of farmland and dense woods that seemed to grow thicker the farther I went. The air turned colder, sharper, as if the place itself knew I didn't belong. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile, the paper slip with Ravenwood written on it sitting in the cup holder, like a silent dare. I still didn't know why the name chilled me, but it did. It felt like a word that carried ghosts. By the time I reached the outskirts, the road had narrowed to a cracked, winding path that forced me to slow down. Trees leaned over it, their branches twisting like fingers ready to snatch at passing cars. My GPS had long since stopped giving directions, leaving me guided only by instinct and the vague memory of the silver-haired woman's instructions. When I finally saw the weathered wooden sign, Ravenwood Estuary 1823, it was so faded that the letters seemed to be disappearing into the wood itself. Something in my gut told me this wasn't just a place. It was a history Eleanor had buried alive. The first signs of the town were almost dreamlike. Rows of old Victorian houses, their paint chipped and roofs sagging under years of neglect. The streets were quiet, too quiet, as if the whole place was holding its breath. I parked near a boarded-up general store and stepped out, the sound of my boots crunching against gravel echoing in the still air. A few curtains in nearby windows twitched, but no one came outside. It wasn't unkind curiosity I felt from the unseen eyes. It was something closer to suspicion, as though I was walking into a story they all already knew, but wished would stay forgotten. I wandered until I found the building I was looking for, The Ravenwood Historical Society. The silver-haired woman had told me it might hold records that could connect Daniel Mercer and Eleanor. Its brick facade was cracked, but the heavy oak door opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, the scent of dust and old paper wrapped around me. A man in his 70s looked up from behind a desk, his eyes narrowing slightly when I gave my name. "You're Eleanor Gray's granddaughter," he said, his tone not quite a question. "We don't get many Grays here." The way he said it made my chest tighten. I told him I was researching family history, but his expression didn't soften. "Some histories are better left where they are," he murmured. Yet he led me into a back room lined with towering shelves of records. I spent hours combing through old census lists, newspaper clippings, and photographs until I found it. A front-page story from 1968. The grainy black-and-white image showed Daniel Mercer standing in front of what looked like a burned-down house. The headline read, "Local tragedy sparks feud between prominent families." My eyes darted to the first paragraph, where Eleanor Gray's name appeared beside his. The article hinted at something dark, an incident that had driven the two families apart, though it never spelled out what. It mentioned the Mercer family leaving town shortly afterward, and how Eleanor had cut all ties. But the strangest part was a quote attributed to her. "I will not let this ruin my future, and I will not let anyone carry his name." My pulse quickened. That had to mean my mother. The decision to erase Daniel Mercer from our family narrative hadn't been a quiet fading of affection. It had been a deliberate act of obliteration. As I traced my fingers over the fragile paper, I realized someone was standing in the doorway behind me. I turned to see a woman around my age, dark-haired, wearing a long coat that seemed too formal for the dusty room. She studied me for a moment before saying, "You shouldn't be here. Eleanor won't forgive this." There was no malice in her voice, just certainty, as if she'd seen what Eleanor's anger could do. I wanted to ask how she knew my grandmother, but she only handed me a folded piece of paper before walking away. When I unfolded it, my breath caught. It was a map of Ravenwood, but someone had drawn an X over a spot at the edge of town. Next to it, in hurried handwriting, were the words, "If you want the truth, start here. But be ready. It's not what you think." My fingers tightened on the paper, my heart pounding. Whatever lay beneath that X was closer to the heart of Eleanor's secrets than anything I had found so far, and I knew, with a cold certainty, that I couldn't turn back now. The map burned in my pocket as I left the Historical Society, its folds already softening from how many times I'd opened and closed it during the walk back to my car. The X marked a place on the far edge of Ravenwood, where the streets faded into woodland. As I drove, the houses became fewer, the road narrower, until it dissolved into a gravel path, flanked by tangled undergrowth. The late afternoon light had turned gold, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like a warning. My chest tightened with every turn of the wheels, my mind running wild with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I parked when the gravel ended and stepped out, the forest swallowing the sound of my movements. Following the map, I walked down a narrow path where roots clawed up through the soil and shadows pooled between the trees. I expected to find an abandoned shed, or maybe a ruin, but what I saw instead made me stop cold. A tall, blackened chimney rising from the ground, all that remained of a burned-down house. The skeletal remains of its foundation lay choked with weeds. The air smelled faintly of ash, even after all these years. I knew instantly this was the place from the newspaper photograph. I moved closer, my boots crunching over shards of brick and rusted nails. A toppled mailbox lay on its side, the paint almost entirely peeled away. When I brushed away the dirt from its surface, a faint name emerged in faded letters. Mercer. My heart kicked hard in my chest. This had been Daniel Mercer's home, the place that had burned in 1968. But standing here, I could feel something heavier in the air than just the memory of fire. It felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath, guarding the truth. Kneeling by the chimney, I noticed something strange. A metal box wedged between two stones, its surface warped by heat but still intact. It took all my strength to pull it free, my hands shaking as I pried it open. Inside, wrapped in layers of brittle newspaper, were a few surviving objects: a silver locket, a singed photograph of a young man and woman standing close together, and a folded letter sealed with wax. My breath caught when I recognized the woman in the photograph. It was Eleanor, decades younger, standing beside Daniel Mercer. They weren't just acquaintances, they looked like lovers. I slid my thumb under the brittle seal of the letter, careful not to tear it more than age already had. The handwriting inside was Daniel's. At least, I assumed it was from the signature at the bottom. His words were hurried, urgent, as if written in a rush before something terrible happened. He spoke of threats, of someone determined to keep them apart, and of a plan to leave Ravenwood together. The last line stopped me cold. If anything happens to me, tell our child the truth. My vision blurred as my mind grasped what he meant. Our child. The wind stirred the ashes around me, carrying the faint sound of footsteps. My head snapped up, and standing on the edge of the ruin was the dark-haired woman from the Historical Society. She didn't look surprised to find me there. "You've found it," she said quietly, her gaze flicking to the letter in my hand. I asked her what she knew, but she shook her head. "Not here," she replied. "They're still watching." Her words sank into me like ice. They, whoever she meant. It was clear she wasn't talking about just curious neighbors. Before I could press her, she turned and disappeared back into the trees, leaving me with the locket, the photograph, and the letter, evidence of a love story my grandmother had erased from existence. My pulse thundered as I realized the implications. Eleanor hadn't just hated Daniel Mercer. She had loved him once. And if the letter was true, she had also carried his child. That child wasn't some distant relative. It was my mother, which meant half of my family tree had been deliberately burned away, just like this house. I stood there for a long time, the shadows lengthening, the cold seeping into my bones. Whatever had happened between Eleanor and Daniel, it hadn't been just a private tragedy. It had been a war. And if someone was still watching after all these years, then the battle wasn't over. I folded the map and slipped it, the photograph, and the letter into my coat. For the first time, I understood why Eleanor's voice had been so sharp when she told me I'd get nothing from her. This wasn't about money. It was about a truth she would destroy everything to keep buried. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the charred remains of the house, the photograph of Eleanor with Daniel Mercer, and that final line from his letter burning in my mind. Tell our child the truth. The weight of it pressed against my chest like a stone. If my mother was the child he spoke of, then everything I knew about my family was a lie. And Eleanor, stoic, distant, unyielding Eleanor, hadn't just been cruel. She had rewritten history. I lay awake until dawn, the pale light spilling through my curtains like the start of something inevitable. By mid-morning, I was back on the road, clutching the map and the letter like lifelines. The woman from the Historical Society hadn't given me her name, but she'd left me with a phrase that haunted me. They're still watching. I didn't know who they were, but the way she'd said it, low, urgent, as if we weren't alone, made my skin crawl. I had the irrational sense that if I didn't find her again, the truth would slip through my fingers forever. The Historical Society was closed when I arrived, its front door locked, blinds drawn. But tucked into the crack of the door was an envelope with my name written in precise cursive. Inside was a single slip of paper, Ravenwood Diner, back booth, noon, come alone. My pulse quickened. There was something about the word alone that set my nerves alight, but I couldn't turn away now. I drove to the diner, every set of headlights in my rearview mirror making me wonder if I was being followed. The diner was a time capsule. Red vinyl booths, the smell of frying bacon, the low hum of conversation. In the far corner, a booth sat in shadow, and she was there, watching me approach. Her dark hair was pinned back now, her clothes plain, as if she were trying to blend into the background. I slid into the seat opposite her, the letter from Daniel hidden in my bag. She didn't speak at first, just studied me like she was deciding if I was worth the risk. "My name is Margaret," she said finally, her voice barely above the clatter of dishes. "And I knew your grandmother. I knew Daniel too. I know what happened the night the fire took him." Her eyes flicked to the window, scanning the parking lot. Eleanor didn't just cut him out of her life. She destroyed him. And it wasn't just about love. It was about something he had, something they both wanted. I leaned forward, my throat dry. "What was it?" I asked. Margaret hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and slid a photograph across the table. It was an old aerial shot of Ravenwood's main street, but my focus snapped to a building at the far end, a stone structure I didn't recognize. "That," she said, tapping it with her finger, "was the old Ravenwood Bank. And the night it burned, Daniel had something from inside it." My heart stuttered. She explained in quick, clipped sentences. There'd been a theft in 1968, something stolen that had never been recovered, something worth far more than money, and Eleanor had been tied to it. The fire that killed Daniel had erased the last trace of what he'd taken, or so everyone thought. I was still trying to process her words when I noticed her glance past me. her body going rigid. She leaned forward sharply. "Listen to me," she said, her tone suddenly fierce. "You're being followed. They know you went to the house yesterday. Whatever you found, don't keep it in your home. Don't keep it anywhere they can reach." Her gaze locked on mine, and I felt a chill sweep over me. This isn't just about family secrets anymore. This is about survival. I wanted to ask her who they were, but before I could, a man in a gray coat entered the diner. Margaret's eyes widened, and she slid out of the booth without another word. She left by the back door, disappearing into the alley like smoke. The man in the gray coat scanned the diner, his gaze lingering on me for just a beat too long before he took a seat at the counter. My hands trembled as I wrapped them around my coffee cup, the weight of Margaret's warning pressing down hard. If Eleanor had been hiding the truth for decades, it wasn't just to save herself from scandal. It was to protect something people were still willing to hurt for. That night, I couldn't stop replaying Margaret's words. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, heavier, as if they were listening. I had tucked Daniel's letter and the photograph of the old bank into a shoebox beneath my bed, but her warning echoed in my mind. Don't keep it anywhere they can reach. Every creak of the floorboards above me and whisper of wind outside made my pulse spike. By midnight, I was sitting in the living room with the lights off, listening. That's when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on my door. Not the tentative kind a neighbor makes, but deliberate, heavy strikes that carried through the walls. I froze, my breath shallow. No one came to see me this late. Not friends, not neighbors, not even delivery drivers. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, but then a voice called through the door, calm and low. "Miss Caldwell, we need to talk." The way they said my last name made my stomach twist. I didn't respond, but the doorknob turned slowly, as if someone was testing it. When it didn't give, they knocked again, harder this time. "We know you have something that belongs to us," the voice said, still eerily steady. My skin prickled. I stayed rooted to the couch, silently praying they would leave. After a long silence, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall, but they didn't fade entirely. Instead, they paused outside, just beyond the peephole's view. I waited a full 10 minutes before daring to approach the window that overlooked the street. A dark sedan sat idling at the curb, headlights off, a figure in the driver's seat unmoving. My throat tightened. Whoever they weren't just making a threat. They were waiting for me to slip up. Margaret's warning now felt less like paranoia, and more like a countdown I'd already started. I knew I couldn't stay there. Shoving the shoebox under my coat, I grabbed my car keys and slipped out the back stairwell, my footsteps muffled against the worn carpet. The alley behind my building was narrow and cold, the air sharp with the scent of rain. I half expected to see another car waiting, but it was empty. I moved quickly, unlocking my car with shaking hands. As I pulled out, I saw the sedan's headlights flare on in my rearview mirror. They were following. I took turns at random, trying to lose them. Left onto Pine, right onto 4th, another right down an unlit residential street, but every glance back revealed the same 2 pinpricks of light trailing me at a steady pace. My palms were slick against the steering wheel. Finally, in a desperate move, I swerved into the parking garage of a 24-hour supermarket and cut the engine, slipping out on foot before the sedan could follow inside. I ducked between rows of parked cars, heart pounding, until I reached the far exit and emerged onto a different street entirely. From there, I made my way to the only place I thought might be safe, the library. It was nearly empty at that hour, but the night security guard recognized me from my frequent visits and didn't ask questions when I slipped into the archives room. The smell of old paper and dust wrapped around me like a strange comfort. I hid the shoebox deep inside a storage box of outdated maps, making a mental note of exactly where. If they broke into my apartment now, they would find nothing. But as I left, a cold realization sank in. Hiding the evidence was only a temporary solution. Margaret had said this wasn't just about family secrets anymore, and tonight had proven her right. Whoever they were, they wanted what Daniel had left behind, and they believed I knew exactly where it was. And the worst part? A part of me suspected they might be right. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen with a chipped mug of coffee, staring at my phone screen. The library's silent corridors and dust-covered shelves had given me a temporary sense of safety, but the moment I stepped back into the open, that feeling evaporated. The sedan might not have followed me home, but that didn't mean they had stopped watching. Margaret's voice kept echoing in my head. "You're not dealing with amateurs. They will not give up." I realized then that waiting for them to make the next move was a mistake. I had to find out what they wanted before they found a way to take it. By sunrise, I had a plan, or something close to one. I pulled up the list of numbers Margaret had scribbled down for me weeks earlier. The ones she claimed were people who once owed Eleanor favors. Most of them were disconnected or led to dead ends, but one number rang long enough for a man to answer in a gravelly voice: Calhoun. When I explained who I was, and mentioned Eleanor Caldwell's name, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "If you're calling me, it means she's gone," he said flatly. I confirmed it. There was a pause before he added, "Then I suppose you're the one they'll be after now." We agreed to meet in a small diner off the highway, the kind with peeling vinyl seats and coffee that tasted faintly of burnt toast. Calhoun was already there when I arrived, a tall man in his late 60s with a weathered face and eyes that scanned the room like a soldier checking for exits. He slid a folder across the table before I even sat down. "Your grandmother wasn't who you thought she was," he said. Inside were grainy black and white photographs, some of Eleanor looking younger, others showing her with people I didn't recognize. One picture in particular caught my attention, Eleanor standing beside a man in front of the same old bank from Daniel's letter. Calhoun explained that the bank was more than just a building. It had been the headquarters for a covert network during the 1970s, one that operated outside the law, but claimed to protect people from corporate and political exploitation. Eleanor had been one of its most influential members, and Daniel, he revealed, had been one of her closest allies. "What's in that shoebox of yours," he said, "is the last piece of proof connecting the bank's original operations to a scandal they've been burying for decades. If it comes out, a lot of very rich, very powerful people will burn." I asked him why Eleanor never told me any of this. He smirked, without humor. "Because if you knew, you'd be in danger before you even understood why. And now, thanks to that will, everyone assumes you do know." His words hit me like a punch. The people following me didn't just want the shoebox. They wanted to make sure I stayed silent forever. Calhoun leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You can't trust the police. Half of them are in someone's pocket. And Margaret, she's a good woman, but she doesn't know the full story. I do." As much as his warning chilled me, there was something in his eyes, a mix of guilt and determination, that made me think he wasn't lying. Still, I kept my guard up. "If you know so much, what's your angle? Why help me?" He hesitated, then said, "Because Eleanor saved my life once, and I never repaid her. You're the closest thing she has left." That admission landed heavier than I expected, stirring a strange loyalty in me toward a grandmother I was only beginning to understand. Before we parted, Calhoun handed me a small, rusted key attached to a faded leather tag. "It's for a safe deposit box. Not the shoebox you have, the real prize Eleanor left behind. But it's not here. You'll need to go to Ridgeway." The name sent a shiver through me. Ridgeway was a town I hadn't visited since childhood, the place where Eleanor's summer house still stood in silent decay. Calhoun's gaze was steady. "If you go there, be careful. You won't be the only one looking." I left the diner with the key burning in my palm, the weight of it far greater than its size. For the first time, I felt I had a direction, but also a clock ticking faster than I could keep up with. Somewhere in Ridgeway was a secret worth killing for, and now I had to decide whether to run toward it or keep running away. By the time I reached Ridgeway again, the afternoon sky had settled into a bruised purple, the kind that warns of a storm, but doesn't promise when it will break. The summer house stood where it always had, but from the moment I saw it, I knew something had changed. The wooden shutters hung at awkward angles. One of the porch steps was cracked clean through, and the front door, usually swollen from years of humidity, was ajar. My heart thudded in my ears as I cut the engine. This wasn't neglect. Someone had been here, and recently. I stepped inside slowly, each creak of the floorboard sounding like an alarm. Dust still clung to the shelves, but there were streaks in it, trails of disturbed footprints leading from room to room. The air smelled faintly of cologne, sharp and foreign. Nothing like Eleanor's lavender sachets, or the damp wood scent I remembered from childhood summers. In the living room, one of the armchairs had been knocked over, and the framed photos on the mantel were all face down as if someone couldn't bear to look at them. The safe deposit box key in my pocket felt suddenly heavier, as though it could be a beacon drawing danger to me. I called out softly, just to test the silence, and regretted it immediately. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked shut. My pulse spiked. I gripped the railing and climbed the stairs slowly, my breath shallow. The hall was dim, lit only by the pale light of the storm through the window at the far end. I reached Eleanor's bedroom and froze. The mattress had been sliced open, stuffing spilling like the insides of an animal. Whoever had been here wasn't just searching. They were tearing the place apart. I backed away, careful not to step on the shards of a broken lamp, and headed for the attic stairs. It was the one place Eleanor always told me not to go as a child, claiming it was full of ghosts and dust. The pull cord for the attic door hung limp, but when I tugged it, the ladder unfolded with a loud metallic groan. I climbed quickly, driven more by instinct than reason, and emerged into the dim, musty space. Boxes were stacked to the rafters, but one in the far corner had been pulled open and rifled through. Inside were letters tied with frayed string, letters that looked old enough to crumble at a touch. As I sifted through them, I found one that stopped me cold. It wasn't addressed to Eleanor, it was from her, dated decades ago. It spoke of a payment owed, and a truth that can't be buried forever. My stomach knotted. This wasn't just family history. This was leverage, maybe even blackmail, and someone else knew it existed. I shoved the letter into my bag, every instinct screaming at me to leave before the storm outside was no longer the only threat. On my way down the attic ladder, I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a footstep directly below me. Someone else was in the house. My body went cold. I gripped the ladder tighter, forcing myself to breathe through the panic. Whoever they were, they hadn't called out, hadn't made themselves known. That meant they weren't here to talk. I slipped down the ladder as quietly as I could and ducked into the hallway closet, pulling the door shut just enough to leave a crack for air. Through the slats, I saw the shadow of a man move across the hall, pausing in front of Eleanor's bedroom before continuing toward the attic. As he passed, the faint glint of something metallic in his hand caught the light. I didn't wait to see more. The moment his footsteps began climbing, I bolted for the stairs, every nerve screaming for me to get out before he came back down. Outside, the wind had picked up, whipping the trees and sending a spray of rain against my face. I didn't look back at the house. I just ran for the car, fumbling with the keys until the engine roared to life. As I pulled away, the first bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the upstairs window, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me go. The storm had broken fully by the time I reached the highway, sheets of rain pounding the windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up. My hands were clamped around the steering wheel, knuckles white, my heartbeat still loud in my ears from the encounter in the house. I should have gone straight back to the city, should have locked the door and called the police, but every part of me resisted the thought of leaving that shadow in Eleanor's house, rifling through what little she'd left behind. Whoever he was connected to the letter I'd found, and if I turned my back now, I might never know why my grandmother's last words to me had carried such venom. Instead of heading for the highway exit, I doubled back, pulling off onto a narrow service road that wound along the edge of the ridge. I parked behind a line of bare oaks, killing the lights, and waited. The rain slicked across the glass, blurring the view, but then I saw it, a figure darting from the house to a waiting car. Even through the distortion of water and distance, I recognized the shape of his shoulders, the way he moved with urgency, but without panic. He wasn't running from me. He was running toward something else. The car he climbed into was an old Navy sedan, its paint dulled from years of weather. I let him get a few lengths ahead before I started mine again, trailing him at just enough distance to keep his taillights faint. We drove like that for miles, through back roads that coiled between thick forest and abandoned farmhouses, until the land opened into a cluster of small, dimly lit buildings. He pulled into a gravel lot beside a rundown tavern, whose neon sign flickered between open and pen. I eased to a stop behind a derelict gas station, cutting the engine. Through the haze of rain, I watched him go inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a clap that seemed to echo across the lot. My pulse kicked harder. This was the kind of place Eleanor never would have gone. Too exposed, too dangerous. I zipped my jacket and stepped into the storm, the cold slicing through me as I crossed the lot. Inside, the tavern smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and something fried long past its prime. The handful of patrons hunched over the bar barely glanced up, but I spotted him instantly, sitting in the back booth with a man whose face I couldn't see. I slipped into a corner table, keeping my head low. The low hum of conversation and clink of glasses made it hard to hear, but every few seconds, one of them leaned forward, their voices dropping to a near whisper. The man I'd followed produced something from inside his coat, a small, weathered envelope that looked frighteningly similar to the one I'd found in the attic. My breath caught. They were trading pieces of Eleanor's life like currency. When the stranger opposite him finally shifted enough for me to glimpse his face, my stomach turned to ice. It was Charles Harrow, the same man who had handled my grandfather's estate years ago, the same man Eleanor had once accused of selling off the family behind her back. If he was involved, this wasn't just about the house or the will. This was about a decades-old betrayal that had been quietly bleeding beneath the surface of my family for years. I was so intent on watching them that I didn't notice the waitress approach until she set a glass of water in front of me. "On the house," she said softly, then leaned down, her voice barely audible over the din. "If you're smart, you'll leave before they see you. Harrow doesn't like loose ends." Her eyes held mine for half a second longer than they should have before she straightened and walked away. Every rational part of me screamed to get up, walk out, and vanish into the rain. But the other part, the one that had grown up watching Eleanor fight for every scrap of respect she'd ever earned, knew this was the moment. If I left now, they'd keep their secrets, and the truth about my grandmother would die with them. I had to know what was in that envelope. I waited until the waitress disappeared into the kitchen, then slid from my seat and circled toward the back, staying in the blind spots of the flickering wall lights. Harrow's voice carried just enough for me to catch a single chilling phrase as I drew closer. "Once this last piece is gone, there's nothing she can do to stop us." My skin prickled. They weren't talking about Eleanor anymore. They were talking about me. The word struck me like a sudden slap, but before I could retreat, the old floorboard under my shoe betrayed me with a sharp creak. Harrow's head snapped up, his pale eyes locking on mine across the dim booth. The man I'd followed twisted in his seat to look too, and in that instant, the air in the tavern seemed to contract. Every muscle in my body tensed, ready for them to rush at me, but neither of them moved. Instead, Harrow leaned back slowly, a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth, cold, knowing, the kind of smile that made you feel like you'd already lost. "Well," he said, his voice low, but carrying easily over the noise of the bar, "if it isn't Eleanor's little shadow." His companion chuckled under his breath, though his eyes stayed on me like a predator's on its prey. I froze where I stood, hands instinctively curling into fists. "Come," Harrow continued, gesturing to the empty space beside him. "If you're going to listen in, you might as well do it from the right seat." The absurdity of the invitation made my heart pound harder. He wasn't angry. He was curious, and that was worse. Every rational thought screamed to run, but my legs carried me forward as if on some reckless autopilot. I slid into the booth across from them, my jacket still dripping onto the cracked vinyl. Harrow watched me closely, his fingers tapping lightly against the envelope on the table. "You've been looking for answers," he said, as though we were already mid-conversation. "And Eleanor, well, she didn't trust you enough to give them herself, did she?" The sting in his words was deliberate, designed to peel back my defenses. I didn't respond. Not yet. My gaze was fixed on that envelope. He noticed and smirked. "Inside is the reason she hated you," he said plainly, as though revealing the weather. Or more precisely, the reason she pretended to. My throat tightened. "Pretended?" I finally asked, the word rough in my mouth. Harrow exchanged a glance with the other man, who gave the slightest nod. "You've been told half a story," Harrow continued, "and half stories are dangerous. But perhaps we can help each other." The way he said help made my skin crawl. I had no idea what he wanted from me, but the possibility that these men could unlock the truth dug its hooks into me. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Harrow leaned forward, lowering his voice until I had to lean in too. "There are certain documents Eleanor kept hidden, not just for spite, for survival. If you find them for us, I'll give you what's in this envelope, and I'll tell you the rest." It was a trap. Every part of me knew it. But the problem with traps is that they're baited with exactly what you think you can't live without. "And if I say no?" I asked. Harrow's smile didn't falter. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering why your grandmother made you her enemy in her final days, and wondering what she left behind that could have been yours." His voice dipped even lower. "And you'll always be one step behind those who already know." The tavern door slammed open, letting in a burst of cold rain and light that briefly illuminated Harrow's face. For the first time, I noticed something almost imperceptible, tiredness in the edges of his eyes, the faint tremor in his hand as he lifted his drink. This wasn't a man acting from pure strength. He needed me for something he couldn't do himself, and that made him dangerous in a whole new way. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. I simply slid out of the booth, forcing my expression into something unreadable. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice flat. Harrow didn't stop me. He just tapped the envelope twice with his fingers, like a gambler reminding you where the stakes sat. As I stepped back into the rain, the weight of his offer settled over me like the storm itself, cold, heavy, and impossible to shake. The rain had turned to a fine mist by the time I reached my apartment, but my clothes still clung damp to my skin. I kicked off my shoes and let the jacket collapse in a sodden heap on the floor, my mind replaying Harrow's offer in loops that refused to slow down. Every syllable, every pause, every glint in his pale eyes, it was all tangled up with the memory of my grandmother's voice, cold and final. "You're not getting a penny from me." I wanted to believe Harrow was bluffing, that the envelope was meaningless. But the truth is, the not knowing was already gnawing at me like a disease. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing the tick of the old wall clock as if it were counting down to some invisible deadline. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I sat up, switched on the lamp, and began sifting through the box of old family belongings I'd shoved into the back of my closet. Yellowed letters, brittle photographs, a chipped brooch I remembered seeing on Eleanor's coat. All these fragments felt suddenly suspect, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too blind to recognize before. It was at the very bottom, tucked beneath a brittle lace handkerchief, that I found the photograph. It was black and white, creased along one edge, the image slightly blurred as though taken in a hurry. My grandmother stood in the center, younger, her hair darker, her expression uncharacteristically tense. But it wasn't her face that stopped my breath. It was the man standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Harrow, looking exactly as he did now, not a day younger. My hands went cold. It didn't make sense. This photo had to be decades old, but there was no mistaking him. The same sharp cheekbones, the same calculating eyes. I turned the picture over, my pulse hammering, and found 3 words scrawled in my grandmother's looping handwriting. "Do not trust." The ink was smudged, as if she'd written it in haste, or maybe in fear. My mind raced with questions. Who was Harrow to her? And how could he look unchanged after all these years? I wanted to shove the photograph back into the box and pretend I hadn't seen it, but the image clung to me. Harrow's offer wasn't just a deal. It was bait. He knew I would dig, knew curiosity would burn hotter than caution. I remembered the tremor in his hand, the tiredness behind his smile. He needed those documents, which meant they weren't just valuable, they were dangerous. By mid-morning, my apartment felt suffocating, the air thick with unanswered questions. I made coffee I didn't drink, paced the floor, and finally grabbed the photograph, sliding it into my bag. If Harrow thought he could pull me into his game without me setting my own rules, he was wrong. I would find those documents first, not for him, but for me. And when I knew what they contained, I would decide what he deserved to know. I started with Eleanor's old house. The lawyer had handed me the keys after the will reading, almost as an afterthought, assuming I'd never set foot there again. The place smelled faintly of cedar and dust, just as I remembered. But now, every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corners, felt different, charged with the possibility of secrets. I set my bag down on the kitchen counter, took a deep breath, and began searching. The drawers and cabinets were mostly empty, the closet stripped bare after the estate sale. But in the study, behind a row of old encyclopedias, my hand brushed something solid. I pulled the books aside to reveal a small, tarnished tin box. The lid was locked, but the lock itself was flimsy. One twist of a hairpin, and it clicked open. Inside were a few folded papers, a brittle newspaper clipping, and, most startling of all, a second photograph. This one showed my grandmother standing alone, except for a shadow behind her, barely visible. The shape of a man I knew without doubt was Harrow. I sank into the old desk chair, my heart racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about inheritance. My grandmother had been tied to Harrow in a way she never wanted anyone to know. And now, the weight of that secret was in my hands. I didn't hear Harrow come in. One moment I was hunched over the tin box in Eleanor's study, the rain hissing against the windows. The next, his voice slid into the room like smoke. "You found it." I turned sharply, my fingers tightening around the photograph as if it could shield me. He stood in the doorway, not out of breath, not wet from the storm, as if he hadn't traveled through the world to get here at all, just stepped from one shadow into another. I wanted to demand answers, to hurl the questions that had been gnawing at me since I found his image in that decades-old photo, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I held up the picture like an accusation. This is from before I was born. You haven't changed. Harrow's eyes softened, almost regretfully, but his smile didn't falter. Some debts are paid in years, he said quietly. Others are paid in lives. Your grandmother knew that. I shook my head. Who are you? The question sounded too small for the enormity of what I felt. He stepped closer, the air between us shifting, heavier now. Someone who once saved Eleanor from a choice that would have destroyed her, he said, and someone she promised would be paid back. The documents in that box, they're the ledger, the record of every debt owed to me. His gaze was steady, including yours. The words lodged like ice in my chest. Mine. Harrow nodded. She bound her bloodline to settle the last of it. When she told you you'd get nothing, it wasn't cruelty. It was protection. She knew if you took what was hers, you'd inherit her bargain too. I wanted to call him a liar, but the handwriting on the back of the first photograph burned in my mind. Do not trust. Yet here he was, telling me trust had never been part of the equation at all. He reached out a hand, palm up. Give me the ledger, and you walk away untouched. Keep it, and you'll understand exactly why Eleanor feared me. The rain outside turned harder, drumming against the glass, a reminder of how little time I had to choose. My pulse was loud in my ears. If I gave it to him, I'd never know the truth. If I kept it, I might not live to regret it. Instead of deciding, I opened the folded papers inside the box. They weren't legal documents. They were letters, dozens of them, written in my grandmother's unmistakable script. And the first began with words that made my vision swim. If you are reading this, it means Harrow has come for you too. My throat closed. She described their meeting in 1953, how he appeared when she was desperate, how he offered help in exchange for a promise she barely understood, how over the years, she watched him remain unchanged while those around her aged, and how she realized, too late, that Harrow didn't deal in money. He dealt in years of a person's life. I looked up from the letter, my skin prickling. You're not human. It wasn't a question. Harrow tilted his head, considering me as though I'd just solved a riddle. Not anymore, he said, and neither will you be, if you keep reading. His voice was calm, but his eyes had a hunger in them that made me step back. I should have been terrified. I should have handed him the box and run. But something in my grandmother's letters, a final one, tucked at the bottom, made my decision for me. It was short, only a single sentence. If you must face him, remember, the debt can be reversed. My hand closed around the box. Harrow's smile faltered for the first time. What are you doing? I took a step toward him, feeling something shift in the air. Settling the debt, I said. And before fear could catch up to me, I spoke the words written in the margin of her last letter, a string of syllables that felt like ice and fire at once. Harrow staggered, his face draining of color, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. You don't know what you've done, he hissed. But I did. The bargain had broken, and for the first time in decades, Harrow looked older, lines etching deep into his face, his hair paling to gray. The storm outside broke as he collapsed to his knees, his voice barely a whisper now. You could have ruled forever. I shook my head, clutching the box to my chest. I'd rather live on my own terms. When I walked out of the house, the air was clear, the rain gone. I didn't look back, but I knew I would never see Harrow again, not as he was. My grandmother's warning still echoed in my mind, but now it was my own voice that answered it. Do not trust, but never forget.